Fetch is a modern promise-based way of making requests to an endpoint. So we're going to be exploring how we can do a get and a post request to endpoints and retrieve back the data using the fetch method. On click of the get button, we're making a get request. So we're getting the input field value. We're adding it as one of the parameters within the URL, making a request a get request. That's being retrieved back from the data arguments, and then we're outputting that value into the web page. So taking the value from the input field and sending it over to the server and waiting for the server response. The next example is going to be using post. So we're going to be updating the fetch method to make a post request, and how we can get content from the fields using the form data object, as well as how we can construct an object and then stringify that object within the fetch body contents and send it over to the server and then retrieve back the contents that we have within the input field. So this again is going over to the server, and then once we've got the response back from the server of the values, we're making use of those values and outputting them into the page. This example, we've got two buttons on the page. One is for get, one is for post. We've got one input field with value contained within there, and then a div on the page with a class of container. Selected those elements using JavaScript, and now we can attach the event listeners to the button. So for the button 1, let's do the on click event. And whenever button 1 gets clicked, then we want to make a fetch request to this endpoint, and that's contained within the HTTP bin. So that allows us to create a testing request, a simple HTTP request, and also retrieve back a response back from that endpoint. And this is a place where you can test and make requests to. So going into, we've got the URL as URL1. So for the fetch requests, this is a more modern JavaScript equivalent of using the XML HTTP request object, and it uses promises. So in the parameter for fetch, and by default it will send a get request. So we don't have to enter in that we're sending a get request. By default, this is going to send a get request. The URL is going to be the http://bin.org/get. So make a request, and this is promise based. So once that endpoint is reached, then it's going to move on to the next stage of the promise, where we're going to return back a response object. And from the response object, we can use the data that's contained within the response object. And this can be, there's several different methods. So we can retrieve it as text. We can also retrieve it as JSON. So if we know the endpoint is going to be JSON. So using the response back and then returning it into the function and returning it to the next stage within the promises as response text, and then select that content and get it as data, and then we'll make use of it, and right now we'll just output it into the console. So we should be able to press the button, make the request, and it gets returned back as text. And then what we could do is we could do a JSON parse using the JavaScript JSON parse method in order to parse the content into a usable JavaScript form, and that will output it, and now it's going to be usable within the JavaScript. We can also, instead of parsing the JSON, we can directly get it returned back as JSON. So there's a default method that you can take the response object, return it back as JSON, and then once is the next part of the promise, it's already going to be in a usable JavaScript format. So compress it, and there's our content that's being output. So we can also update to the URL where we can add in some arguments. So we'll take the URL 1, and I'll use the template literals. So those are the backticks to the left of the 1 key on most keyboards. So that's the main URL, and then with the question mark, let's add in a value. And the value that we're adding is coming from the myInputVal. I'll create a separate variable for that value. We add it in here where we're going to be doing the request, and we're updating the URL that we're requesting to. And that's how we can send parameters within the request object. And there's our arguments, and contained within the arguments is the value of val that then we can output and we can make use of. So it's returning back the arguments with the property value of val, and there's our name. So that's coming from the input field, being sent over to the server, and then responded back from the server. So once we have the data, then we can output it on the page. So what we'll do is we'll create a function, and I'm going to call this adder. And what this function will do is this will add whatever content we want into the web page within the main content area. So we've got our main output, and that's going to be the parent. So let's create a div, and using the document create element, the element that we're creating is going to be a div, and within the div element we're going to set the text content to whatever we've got for the value of the adder. So this can also be HTML, so we can just assign it to HTML, and maybe we want to set this to inner HTML. And then within the adder, the argument that we're passing is going to be the HTML value. And that's just going to be whatever value we're outputting right now into the console. And then the last part is where we're going to add it to the parent. So using the append, we're going to append the newly created div to the parent so that we can see it on the page. We can also create a holding array, and then this will give us a list of items. So that can give us a length of the items that we've added. So every time we take holder and we push whatever we've got for the HTML on the page, and then for the inner HTML, let's update this. And this will output a value for holder length. And then we've got the value of the HTML that was passed in to the function. So that just gives us a way to track, as we click it, the different items that we have on the page. So let's create another function, and this one is going to be to handle the click event on button number 2. And this is where we want to do the post of the content. So we want to select the content as form content and post to the URL. And post is going to require us to make some updates to the options for the fetch request. So within the options, we can set a method, and the method that we're going to be using, so first off, we're going to use get, and then we can update it to post. So get, and this should do the exact same thing as we do have within the other request, as we're still going to URL 1. We're sending the data over, and we just added in the property of get within the options. So that by default is always going to be a get, so that's why we don't have to add it in actually. And we can also update this to post. And when we're sending a post request, it's expecting different options within the post. So we do need to have a body object within the post. So set the body object. And the body object can be form data. So I just call it FD for form data. And we're going to create a new form data object. And then let's add some content into it where we're going to append to the form data, append the value. And that value is going to be coming from the variable value from the input field. We won't need the URL anymore. And then you can add additional values as needed. So just as we did before, where we can append values. So if we had a value for ID, and maybe the ID was 1, these are the values that we can send in. So now we're going to be sending to the second URL. So that's the URL 2, where it's expecting a post response. So save that and do a post. And right now we're getting undefined. So comment out the content, and the structure is going to be different. That's being returned back within data. So take a look and we'll see what we do get back within data. So again, it's within the form instead of within the arguments and being sent in to the body. So let's update the adder to have the value from the form, and whatever we've got for the property, or for the value of the property val. That's coming from data. So now we should be able to send this into adder, and that should be adding using the post. And I'll just update this to include post, and this other one will be updated to say get, so that we can distinguish between the two as we're outputting them into the page. And just put a quick space there so that's a little bit more readable. So there's our get request, and there's our post request, making the trip to the server and returning back the response content using either the post or the get. And this is how you can add in the form contents. You can also add in contents as an object. So if we want to create an object, and it all depends on what your server is looking for. So if we have a key of val and assigning it to a value of val, and let's do the ID. So those are the key names, 500, and we'll send the my object over to the endpoint. So we get a post, and we're getting undefined, because once again the structure is going to be different. So it's no longer going to be sending it within the form value. And let's see what we're getting back from the object, where we've got the contents and the data object is within an object format. So what that means is that it wasn't properly able to retrieve this because it's not able to send it directly as an object. So your body has to be a string value, which can then be used as the object content. So you have to do the JSON stringify in order to connect and retrieve back the data. In this case, the data is not being returned back, it's being returned back as text. We do have it within the JSON response. So we've got a JSON response within the server, and now we can output the value once again this way. So it does depend on how you're constructing the content that you're sending, and also how your data server is responding to that content. So go ahead and try it out, and try out the different methods in order to get more familiar with what you can do with Fetch, doing both a get and a post request.